So welcome back to another Thursday on the Pagan Perspective. I'm Yeka, and this week we are continuing the month's theme of political topics. So the topic is posted below, but I'm going to go ahead and read it to you as well. And it is, I would like to hear some pagan perspectives on more social issues. As a pagan, what are your thoughts on in vitro fertilization, IVF, versus adoption? How did you reach those opinions, and how does that relate to your path? Thanks. So, I have tried recording this video multiple times already, and they have all turned out really, really long. So I'm going to try and bring it in because I keep going off on these really long tangents, so I'm going to try and keep it at a length that is actually going to be watchable. So the first thing that I wanted to say is that I think, well, there's a lot of topics that come in and start to get tangled up in this, and one of them is the idea of souls, and I think it really does connect to this when we talk about the in vitro because of the multiple embryos involved and all of that. But it seems to be a common belief in the 21st century, and I don't really know the history of this belief, but I've observed that the belief in souls is very widespread. This idea somehow that there is something more to us than what we are, if that makes sense. There's this thing that comes into our body, that occupies our body, and often this idea that it only gets one chance. Or some people who believe in reincarnation think that it gets multiple chances. But when we start talking about objections that people have to abortion or to there being multiple embryos, some of which get discarded in the in vitro process, somehow there seems to be this belief that at the moment of conception, which is two different packages of genetic information coming together, getting mixed up, and creating a new packet of information, which then can eventually become a new individual organism, right? Some people think that there's this soul that enters into it or becomes part of it. I don't buy that. I don't really, the soul thing doesn't make sense to me. I know some people think about it a little bit differently, but it doesn't really fit in with how I see the world, which really is what my path. I want to try and tie this back to the question because the viewer did really ask about, how did we reach that and how does it affect our path? But as often gets mentioned when people talk about in vitro fertilization, is that multiple embryos get fertilized and not all of them get implanted. And those that don't hang out in storage until they either get used or discarded. And some people have a problem with that. My view on that topic is that so an embryo is, well, and they're not, I don't know if they're technically even embryos at that point, but I mean that's just going to be semantics on at what stage we start calling. I don't think it's an embryo until it actually goes through implantation, but I could be wrong, right? Because so the fertilization takes place, it's a single cell at that point, becomes 2, 4, 8, 16, etc. But there's this whole period of time, which is that really scary period of time that a lot of you women and some men secondhand understand, of when you're like, you can't take the test yet. But there's this period of time so the fertilization happens and the woman's body doesn't even know it, right? Because a whole week it has to travel down the tube before it implants into the uterine wall. And at that point, the woman's body starts making hormones, and you can tell whether there's a possibility to tell whether there's a pregnancy or not. So I don't think it's technically, I think it's a blasto something before then. But anyways, see, this is what I was talking about going off on tangents, because a lot of this stuff is really interesting to me, and so I just start pulling it in from everywhere. But where was I? Yeah, so my view on that is that particular combination of genes, which then gets to make proteins and gets to make this thing that gets to have experiences and interact with the world, and that's what becomes a person, a person being something with a personality. So I'm not limiting person to just being human, but anyways, eventually a human embryo gets to be a human. Most of them don't ever get there. But the pattern, okay, I'm gonna have to edit this. So it's a pattern, and that pattern got to be formed by this combination of the patterns from the parents, not their whole patterns, parts of their patterns. I'm sure you guys have taken biology in high school, if not college. You kind of remember a little bit about how that process works. If not, awesome videos on YouTube that you can watch about documentaries and stuff. Anyways, so when you were formed, or when I was formed, right, setting aside all of the times that our parents had sex that didn't result in fertilization of a baby, just the one, pretend that they only had sex even once, just once, which is not what happened for most of us. There were about 40 million sperm cells, and only one of them ended up getting to be the pattern that got to be you. So for every one of those 40 million, and let's just assume that the recombination, there wasn't the randomness and the recombination and everything later on, pretend that there was only one possible outcome from the combination of one sperm to one egg. There were 40 million opportunities for different patterns. None of those patterns are any less valid than the pattern that ended up being you, that you got to end up being. So that's how I see those other embryos, as patterns that never would have been anyways. So they got to be that, they got to become a zygote, right? Okay, so they got to that stage, but never would have been a fully developed human anyways. So I don't see anything wrong. Again, we can talk about my ideas about what right and wrong, if that even is something that exists, but that I don't see that as being wrong, because they never would have anyways. So I don't really have a problem with that aspect of it. I know I've probably already gone over my time on just this one little piece. But that didn't really seem to be, when we're comparing it to adoption versus in vitro fertilization, the issue which is probably being talked about more is, or being thought about more, is the idea that there are all of these children out there that are in existence or going to be born that don't have parents. For a lot of people, there's an objection to making new people when there already are other people that need help. But I don't really see that as being all that different from a couple that doesn't have challenges with fertility, choosing to have a baby and bringing a baby into the world. I don't see why this is all that different from what are we calling it, the old-fashioned way, from a traditional birth. So the issue is, does one want to adopt, or does one want to have their own? And actually, as I'm saying that, I realize that some people might have issue because they think it is not natural. My response to that is, you're probably hundreds of miles away from me. I recorded this many hours, if not days, or weeks, months, or even years ago, as I looked into a synthetic lens, and then the whole process of watching this on a computer, not so natural. I'm wearing contacts in my eyes right now, not natural. My argument is actually that that's all natural, because natural is of nature, and nature is everything that actually is. But by the way that nature or natural is being used in this case, well, that's not natural. So I do really understand the desire to have one's own child as opposed to adopting, because there's some pretty powerful instinctual primal emotions that are connected with bearing a child, with that feeling it within you, with the nursing, if that's what you end up doing, with the giving birth, with the I'm getting attacked by a cat right here, sorry. And that connection of seeing of your genes, which I think has been, which has been programmed into us over millennia, or longer than that, since, long before we were even close to being human. He really wants to play. He gets all wild, and then I try and pick him up, and he doesn't want to calm down at all. He just wants to play. And the other thing is, I think that reproduction is one of the most powerful tools, and one of the only really powerful things that an individual has in the scheme of our species. Because when we reproduce, we are making a choice as to what our species will be. What our species is, what it is to be human, was hugely impacted by the choices that our ancestors made in who they wanted their mates to be, and thus the qualities that they wanted their children to have. So you've probably heard talk about how we've been domesticating ourselves. Yes, we very much have been doing that based on our sexual selection. We've gone, I don't really want to have a kid with that super violent, not nice guy. I think I'm going to have a long-term relationship with this nice person who's calmer. I'm going to have their kids. And that, maybe not quite as conscious as that, but that choice has been made over and over and over and over again. And that has resulted in us. And so when we choose to reproduce, whoever we choose to reproduce with, we are making choices for what our species will be. Now, one can argue that, well, if you make a choice that's totally different than what everybody else is making, then there's, that might get watered down, or, the chance for that particular trait or those traits to survive is less likely. But really you are putting those traits, or the possibility of those traits, because those might not be genetically determined, or they might not get passed on to the child, or they might get recombined in a different way. So anyways, let me see how I can edit this video down into something that seems really cohesive. But basically, I've been all around talking about these different ideas that all kind of connect in there. Basically, I think that it's a personal choice of the people involved. I really understand the desire to have one's own. It's an issue that I have not faced. I maybe have had somewhat of the opposite problem, if to be honest. But I don't know what choice my partner and I would make if we decided that this was the time. I mean, we do at some point definitely want to have our own little people, but if we decided, and it was challenging for us, definitely not opposed to adoption, but also really attached to the idea of bearing my own child. But anyways, I want to go into the rest of the question, which is, how do we reach those opinions, and how does that relate to our paths? So how do the opinions, I think opinions are something that we come to over many years. Sometimes they can be shorter too, but everything that we experience in our life leads to how we view things. And so a lot of that comes from the type of the family that I was raised with, and the types of attitudes, which I'm probably not even aware of, and not really aware that are even impacting me, that my family had, and with the people that I was raised around. But also I think a lot of my opinions have been strongly influenced by the classes. Also, I do need to note that I did grow up with some kids that were conceived through non-traditional methods, and I think that might have an impact. How does it relate to my path? So I guess based on a few past comments, it's been a little bit confusing to some of the viewers what my path is. And for me, it's about being connected with the world that I'm in, which is nature, which the world which I am part of. And for me, I have a real big focus on being much more directly connected, which has been a challenge in the last year or two, just because of some financial issues and having to move around a lot. We haven't been able to do a lot of growing our own food, but that's something we definitely want to get back into. But trying to be as connected with the world as possible, and going back to the old root of the word pagan, which is coming from people of the countryside, and looking at this really down-to-earth centered, nature-centered belief and view. So, which very much based on observation and learning. So one of the really important things in my path is that I believe that there isn't a right and a wrong. I believe that there's that we make sense out of the patterns of the world around us, that we're part of. I keep saying around, but I really do think that we're part of, and it's an important distinction to make, that we're not on this planet, we are part of this planet, that sort of thing. But the personal choice, I think, is really very important, and the recognition of human as natural is very important too, and that kind of ties into all of this. I am being begged for dinner. I don't know if you can actually hear him. So I've made this video way too long already. I'm going to edit it and hopefully get it up for you guys. Okay.